On that gray morning, the office already seemed quieter than usual. Kaio, in his early 30s, arrived early, as usual, his eyes shining with hope. He had worked hard to present an idea that, in his view, could transform the way the company operated, bringing benefits not only to the bottom line but also to the work environment. It was the kind of proposal he had been developing for weeks, thinking through every detail, and he was eager to share it with everyone. But Kaio never imagined what was to come. The meeting began slowly, with the same lukewarm discussions as always, until it was his turn. Kaio took a deep breath and began to present his project. He spoke enthusiastically, explaining each step carefully, the colleagues around him paying attention, some even leaning in to hear better. But in the middle of his speech, before he could even show the positive impact of his idea, he was abruptly interrupted. "Kaio, enough!" The voice of Roberto, the boss, echoed through the room. Kaio froze. His eyes went from the papers to Roberto's face, who was staring at him with a rigid, almost mocking expression. "Tell me, Kaio," Roberto continued, crossing his arms and leaning back in his chair with an irritatingly superior posture. "Do you really believe that this little idea of yours will change anything around here? Do you think you know more than the rest of us?" With each word Roberto spoke, it seemed as if he was pouring a load of accumulated frustration directly onto Kaio. It was as if, instead of a boss talking to an employee, there was an adult reprimanding a naive child, someone incapable of realizing the ridiculousness of his own audacity. "Because, to me, all of this sounds like a waste of time, Kaio," Roberto continued. "Here you are, just another number. Do you understand? You do what we ask, period. I don't want your innovations. I want you to do your job and leave the grandiose plans to those who understand business." Those words hit hard, like an invisible punch to the chest. Kaio felt his stomach sink, his face heating up as furtive glances were exchanged around the room. Some classmates lowered their heads. Others looked away, as if they could sense the shame he now carried. It was an uncomfortable silence, where each second seemed longer than the last, and the entire room went cold, as if the walls had absorbed all the humiliation that filled the air. Kaio tried to take a deep breath, to remain calm, but inside he was destroyed. The wounded pride, the effort of years, the sacrifices he had made to prove himself. Everything seemed to wither inside him, like a trampled flower. He could barely hear the noises around him, as thoughts began to scream in his head. "Am I really just another number?" he asked himself. The weight of being treated as if his value were disposable crushed his heart, leaving invisible marks. With heavy steps, he left the room, trying to ignore the looks of pity and discomfort from his classmates. He hurriedly crossed the hallway, looking for a place to breathe. Every beat of his heart was a bitter reminder that he had dedicated himself to that company as if he were building a home. But in reality, to them, he was just someone who occupied a chair. How many times had he stayed late, missed family parties, put his own life aside to respond to urgent demands? And now, when he finally felt he could do something meaningful, his aspirations were destroyed with a coldness he would never forget. Kaio locked himself in the bathroom, leaning against the cold wall, trying to control the wave of emotions rising in his throat. He felt anger, sadness, and a feeling of emptiness that swallowed him. It was as if all the effort and sweat he had dedicated over the years were being erased there, in that single moment. And even worse, he couldn't understand why it affected him so much. After all, it wasn't the first time Roberto had treated someone like that. But there alone, he knew the reason. This time, the pain was his. He was no longer the observer of other people's humiliations. He was the target. A flame began to ignite in his heart. It was small, like a spark, but it came from pain, anger, and disrespect. It was the flame of someone who realizes that something inside them can no longer accept being treated as less. There, in that moment of pain and wounded pride, Kaio understood that if he were not the one to take care of his dignity, no one would. And although he knew that that wound would not heal overnight, he made the decision that he would not let it define him. He left that bathroom different, with his head held high and a new determination that, although silent, carried the strength of a lifetime of struggles and sacrifices. Kaio arrived home that night, as if carrying an invisible but crushing weight. He went in, threw his keys on the table, and stopped in front of the hallway mirror. A simple mirror that had always been there, but now looked different. There was something unsettling about his own reflection. Something about him seemed smaller, almost erased. The tired lines around his eyes, the closed expression, the slumped shoulders. Everything screamed that he was no longer the same man he had been years ago, the one who dreamed big and believed that his efforts would be rewarded. Something inside Kaio was crumbling, as if all the pieces of pride and faith in himself were scattering before his eyes. He took a deep breath and, as he stared at his own reflection, he found himself imagining a younger version of himself. Images of that difficult childhood came flooding back, and suddenly he felt the presence of his father, a figure so real in his memory that it almost seemed to be there, watching him. Growing up with his father was like walking on a path of sharp stones, where any mistake, any stumble, was treated as an unforgivable flaw. Kaio's father had always had a very particular view of life. He believed that the only way to become someone was to win, to be impeccable, and to never show weakness. Kaio's father was one of those men who believed that feelings were for the weak. If Kaio came home, still a boy, sad about something that had happened at school, his father would look at him with a cold, almost rigid look and say, "You're not going to get anywhere by crying. A real man doesn't waste time on nonsense." The words were harsh and dry, but he had gotten used to them. With each failure, with each held-back tear, he just tried to convince himself that he was becoming stronger, that by enduring this hardship, he was building the strength that his father admired. But that night, as he looked at the man he had become, Kaio realized that his father's demands still weighed on him, even after all these years. He wondered why he still felt like a prisoner of that past, of the insatiable need to prove his worth, as if, in order to be complete, he still needed his father's recognition. This constant search for validation, as he himself knew, had influenced every decision he had made up until that point. It was as if his desire to succeed in his career, to be someone important, was less about his own dreams and more about the desire to finally hear his father say, "I'm proud of you." The boss's words that morning brought up a painful memory, a memory he had buried deep down, but that now pulsed within him, full of life. He remembered his father saying that those who cried or were easily shaken would never achieve anything. "Easy is for losers," his father would say, always demanding, always strict. Kaio then realized that every time he sought an achievement or worked tirelessly to show his worth, he was actually doing it to dispel that shadow that had been with him since he was a child. Each victory was like an internal cry that, perhaps, he was finally becoming the man his father would respect. But now he was exhausted. The weight of all these demands seemed to squeeze his heart, and he began to question himself. Was working so hard, being someone that others valued, really what he wanted? Or was it just a desperate attempt to erase the wounds of a past that he had never really faced? With the humiliation he had experienced at work, that silent effort seemed to lose its meaning. Why did he still need validation? Why did he still feel that he would only be someone of value if other people, if his father, recognized him? Sitting alone in the room, Kaio felt tears fill his eyes. They were not tears of weakness, but of relief. It was the first time that he truly accepted the weight of it all, of all the pressures and expectations that he had carried since he was a child. And at that moment, something inside him began to change. He realized that perhaps it was time to stop seeking recognition that would never come. Perhaps it was time to look at himself, not as a reflection of his father's dreams and frustrations, but as someone free to decide his own path. Kaio knew that leaving this past behind would require a lot of courage. But for the first time, he felt that he was ready to try. The night was dark and cold, the kind of night that left the streets empty and silent. Kaio walked slowly, listening to the echo of his own footsteps, trying to organize the thoughts that were racing through his mind. Each step was an attempt to ease the weight he had been carrying since the morning. After the humiliation he had experienced in front of everyone, he felt small, as if the world around him had become too big for him. The cold air cut his face, and the city, with its lights twinkling in the windows of tall buildings, seemed like a distant memory of the life he had built, but which he now questioned whether it was really his. As he walked, he found himself looking at the illuminated windows of the apartments around him, imagining the stories behind each one of them. There was a kind of comfort in knowing that, inside, ordinary people were living their lives, each with their own problems, their own pains, and their own joys. It was strange how this dark night brought a little peace to his heart, as if, somehow, the silent emptiness of the city was the only thing capable of welcoming his sadness without question. After some time, Kaio arrived at a small square, where a gentle breeze blew through the trees. He looked for a bench to sit on, letting himself be enveloped by the silence, while the cold seemed to be part of him. He closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of tiredness, and when he opened them again, he noticed someone approaching. It was a familiar face. Marcos, an old friend he hadn't seen for years, was approaching the bench with a slight smile, as if he had already foreseen the pain hidden in Kaio's eyes. "Kaio, it's been a while," Marcos said, with a welcoming expression and a touch of surprise in his voice. He sat down next to Kaio without ceremony, and instead of asking what brought him there, he simply waited. Kaio remained silent, but he didn't need to say much. His friend, upon seeing him there, knew that something heavy had brought him to that lonely night. "You know, Marcos, I think I'm tired," Kaio said, finally breaking the silence, unable to hide the sadness in his voice. He began to tell, with hesitant words, about the humiliation he had suffered at work, about the demands of a lifetime, about the burden of always having to prove his worth. As he spoke, he felt lighter, as if each word released a little of the accumulated weight. Marcos listened attentively, without interrupting. When Kaio finished, he took a deep breath, as if he were absorbing every detail of the story. "I understand, Kaio," he began, with a look full of understanding. "I've been through similar situations. There were times when everything seemed to fall apart, when it seemed like everything I had built was worthless. I was humiliated, I fell. And do you know what I learned? That sometimes pain is the best fuel." He paused, letting Kaio absorb each word. "These difficult situations, even though they are bitter, have something powerful. They make us see what really matters." Kaio looked at his friend, still in doubt, but he felt that those words touched him. Marcos continued, as if he could read Kaio's heart. "I also spent years trying to prove my worth, seeking everyone's approval, but it was only when I left aside what others thought, when I stopped trying to be perfect for others, that I started living for myself." He smiled slightly, with a look of someone who had already walked that road. "I transformed the pain into motivation, not to prove anything to others, but to myself, to live according to what I believed in." Kaio felt something change inside him. That conversation seemed to bring order to the chaos of his feelings. He had never allowed himself to stop and think about what he really wanted, what made him happy. Throughout his life, what drove him was the need for approval, to show that he was good enough. But now he felt that this path was leading him to a dead end. Maybe, as Marcos said, it was time to reformulate his goals, to understand what really mattered. They stayed there for a few more minutes, in silence, listening to the sound of the trees swaying in the wind, each one immersed in their own thoughts. When Kaio finally got up, he felt different. Not that all his problems had been solved, but the seed of change had been planted. The pain from that morning had not disappeared, but now he saw that he could use it in another way, as a kind of compass for a new direction. He said goodbye to Marcos with a sincere hug and went home with a new feeling in his chest, something he had not felt for a long time: hope. The sun had not yet risen on the horizon when Kaio woke up, but this time the weight on his chest that had suffocated him the night before seemed to have dissipated. He lay there for a few seconds, listening to the stillness around him and feeling a tranquility he had not experienced in a long time. Marcos's words still echoed in his mind, lighting a silent but powerful flame within him. He knew what he needed to do. He got up, dressed slowly, as if savoring each gesture, and looked at his reflection in the mirror. Unlike the night before, now there was a firm, determined look there. He He said goodbye to home with a clear purpose, and on the way to work, his mind was calm. He knew that that day would mark the beginning of a new phase, even if it meant facing once and for all the shadow of his past and the cold figure of his boss. As he entered the office, he felt the curious glances of some colleagues falling on him. He greeted each one with a discreet nod, walking straight to Roberto's office, his boss. With a firm touch, he opened the door and entered. Roberto, sitting behind his desk, looked at Caio with a mixture of surprise and indifference, a slight smile of disdain forming on his face. "Caio, what do you want?" Roberto asked, with that impersonal tone of someone who believes he has complete control of the situation. But at that moment, Caio was not the same man as before. He took a deep breath, keeping his gaze fixed on his boss. There was no more hesitation in his voice, nor that trace of insecurity that had held him back so many times. "Roberto, I came here because there is something I need to say," he began, his voice firm, but full of a self-respect that Roberto had never witnessed before. "I have always been a dedicated employee, willing to give my best for the company, and I have always taken my work seriously. But yesterday, when I was treated the way I realized that I was forgetting something essential: respect. I owe respect to myself and my career." Roberto seemed surprised and even a little uncomfortable with Caio's attitude. In his mind, it was difficult to associate the man in front of him with that silent employee who always lowered his head. "What are you insinuating, Caio?" Roberto asked, crossing his arms in a defensive gesture. Caio took a step forward, but without losing control, with a serenity that showed he was not there to argue, but to declare something important. "I'm saying that I will no longer accept being treated as just another number. I worked hard, I sacrificed moments of my life, and not to be humiliated. I deserve more. And for that reason, I'm making a decision that you might not expect," Caio continued, his voice full of conviction. "I'm leaving my position, not out of weakness, but because I'm determined to pursue something that really has meaning to me, something that makes my time worthwhile." Roberto's gaze changed, and a touch of disdain mixed with a nervousness he tried to hide. For him, someone like Caio, who had always been so submissive, would never have the audacity to resign, much less to walk away in search of his own purpose. "Are you sure about that, Caio? It's not as easy out there as you think. It's not simple to follow your dreams and find meaning. The world demands results, sacrifices. Are you willing to risk everything?" Roberto asked, trying to regain control, but this time his words seemed to lose their effect. Caio smiled, not arrogantly, but with a peace he had never felt before. He no longer cared about his boss's words or the uncertainties that would follow. For the first time, Caio no longer felt like his life was a burden he carried in silence. At that moment, he understood that he had the power to choose, to decide, and that he didn't need to live according to anyone's expectations. "I'm more than willing, Roberto," he replied, looking his boss in the eye, "because for the first time, I feel like I'm taking control of my own life. I may have many challenges ahead, but I'm ready to face them. I'm tired of living in fear. I want something that makes sense to me, that I can be proud of." With that last statement, Caio turned and left the room, feeling as if he had left years of burden behind. As he walked out of the company, he felt a fresh wind, as if life itself was congratulating him on his decision. He looked around and realized that, no matter how uncertain the future was, he was finally free. Free from the chains of the past, from the demands of a boss who had never respected him, and from the shadows of a life he hadn't fully chosen. As he crossed the building's doors, Caio took a deep breath, his chest light, and new hope emerging. He knew that the path would not be easy, that he would have to build his own path from scratch. But now, what mattered was not the recognition of others, nor the search for approval that never came. What mattered was himself, the truth he carried in his heart, and the destiny that he finally began to write with his own hands. Months had passed since that decisive day, when Caio said goodbye to his old job. The world out there, he knew, was not an easy place, but each new day he faced with courage and determination made him feel stronger, more complete. "I had chosen to start from scratch, not just in work but in life. And the first step was to rescue what, in the rush and pressure of everyday life, he had left aside: his passion for helping and inspiring other people. With his accumulated experience and the desire to make a difference, Kaio founded a small company. It wasn't a big firm, nor something that caught attention at first glance, but it was a reflection of everything he believed in. He wanted his company to be a place where people felt valued, where they could collaborate and grow together. Working with him was like being part of a true team, where everyone had space to express ideas and see their efforts recognized. In the beginning, the challenge was great. He spent sleepless nights studying, planning every detail, paying attention to each client, and doing his best to gain space in a competitive market. However, Kaio no longer let himself be overcome by difficulties. He felt deeply that he was building something true, and the motivation that this brought was much stronger than any insecurity. His days were filled with hard work, but this time, he knew the reason for every effort, every moment dedicated to his project. The first clients arrived timidly, recommended by friends and acquaintances who trusted Kaio's work. But soon, something curious began to happen. The customers he served not only returned, but brought new ones. They felt something different about Kaio's work: a genuine attention, an empathy and patience that they rarely found elsewhere. Kaio knew how to listen, he knew how to understand the needs of each client, and that made all the difference. Within a few months, his small company was already beginning to stand out, attracting customers and employees who identified with his vision. Time passed, and Kaio, now more mature and fulfilled, felt at peace. His work, once just an obligation, had become a source of true satisfaction. It wasn't the numbers that moved him, but the opportunity to transform lives, to support and guide his employees, offering them the environment that he himself had so desired in the past. He learned that real leadership is not built with shouts or threats, but with respect and understanding. The humility and empathy he demonstrated on a daily basis reflected his personal growth, and everyone around him noticed the difference. It was on a sunny afternoon, during an event in the area, that Kaio had an unexpected encounter. He was talking to other professionals when, at a glance, he saw Roberto, his former boss, on the other side of the room. At first, he felt a slight uneasiness in his chest, but he quickly realized that the weight of the past was no longer affecting him. He was over it. She felt so at peace that she decided to approach and greet him. Roberto, seeing him, took a few seconds to recognize him. It was as if Kaio was a completely different person. He had a confident posture, a serene expression, and a sparkle in his eyes that Roberto had never noticed before. When shaking Kaio's hand, Roberto tried to hide his discomfort, but he couldn't hide his surprise at seeing his former employee's success. "Kaio, you look different," said Roberto with a slight embarrassment in his voice. "I heard that you are in charge of a new project. Congratulations. I'm happy for you." Kaio smiled, with the kindness of someone who understood how important that moment was. He responded simply, without the need to prove anything to anyone. "Thank you, Roberto. I'm finally working on something that makes sense to me, and it's been an incredible experience." Roberto nodded, still speechless, while Kaio continued forward with firm steps. He knew his transformation didn't need external validation. "I had found true security, the one that comes from the courage to be true to yourself, to face your fears and reinvent yourself." He understood that it was no longer the opinion of his former boss or anyone else that gave him value. The true validation was in the peace he now carried with him, in the choice he made to build his own path. Life, full of challenges, would continue to surprise him, but Kaio no longer feared the unknown. He had achieved something precious: the freedom to live according to his own values.